Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures, and today we're doing part 98 of our Planet Zoo mod spotlights, where we take a look at some of the wonderful mods people will be making and use them to talk about some of the wonderful biodiversity that we share our world with. And today, we've got another really cool batch of fish. This is kind of those big, 30 or so fish drops that Leaf and Buffsuit do, but a lot of the reports, I believe this will be the last, I'm going to have two more episodes of this, so 100's going to be the special one, and I'm going to have a few extra mods from there, but 101's going to have more fish mods, but it doesn't matter. I do enjoy fish mods, and it's a good excuse to talk about some wonderful fish. So, enough talking about that. We're going to be moving on to the common minnow. So we're starting off with the common minnow. Really cute little fish as we get to see in here. So the common minnow, as you can kind of see here, these guys, their scientific name is Phonictus, which means certain river fish, which is pretty cool. And these guys are a type of minnow, which are again a type of carp. So these guys like fresh water or brackish water, and they like temperatures between 2 and 20 degrees, and quite wide-ranging. They pretty much live all across Eurasia. I think these guys are going in for a food, but I want to see if we can find one on land. We'll just skip through a bit. We want to make sure that this one's going off this one there. So this is a Eurasian fish that can be found across the basins of the Atlantic and northern Baltic seas, across the Arctic and also the northern Pacific Oceans. Basically from France up to the more drainage basins in Korea, so basically all across that area of Eurasia. So very, very widely spread. And they can be found in Iceland, Ireland, where they were possibly introduced. And then from Great Britain up to like Scandinavia and Russia and up into the drainage areas of there, like Kazakhstan, things like that. So a very, very wide-ranging species. And they're not particularly huge fish, but they're still rather awesome. These guys get to about 14 centimeters in length. So a common length about 7 centimeters. So a quite big one would be 14 centimeters. And they reach about a maximum age of about 11 years old, so that's quite a long lived for a little fish like this. And look at this cute little guy here. So you can see here they've got these lateral lines usually kind of reach behind the anal fin. That's kind of the characteristic that defines these guys between other related species. And you can see they often have this kind of bands going on there with the breast scales as well. And they have these vertically elongated blotches of color that go down here that kind of give them that distinct appearance and make them think, oh, that's definitely a common minnow. Really, really awesome fish. In terms of their biology, these guys are gregarious, so these guys often live in very large groups. They can be found in a wide range of cold, well-oxygenated habitats, from like small, fast-flowing streams up to like large Nordic lowland rivers, and from small up lakes to large lakes. So basically anywhere there's fresh water, these guys will be there. And they usually occur in association with other types of salmon fish, though they're not that closely related to both fishes, or raven fishes as well. But they are often found with salmons and things like salmon that you can find there, salmonoids and those type of fish. And they feed on algae, plant debris, mollusks, and insects. So they're quite a varied diet in that regard, which helps them be quite common, so that's how they get their name. So they generally spawn over clean gravel areas and flowing water, or on like wave-washed shores of lakes as well. But they overwinter with coarse substrates or in deep pools with low currents. And they will migrate upstream to find the shallower gravel areas to breed as well. And they're also, in terms of like human importance, these guys are also quite an important laboratory fish. They are captured and used a lot for research on sensory organs of fish. And they can be locally threatened by pollution and extensive stocking of species like Salamo. So a species in that genus, as I mentioned, they like to hang around types of salmons. So that's a really bad thing if they're overstocked. And in terms of their breeding behavior, these guys form schools separately, and then they will arrive at a spawning site at different times. And they spawn over these clean gravel areas in the flowing water or on wave-washed shores and lakes, and they deposit these eggs in shallow water or on sand or gravel bottoms, and they typically hatch about 4 or 5 days after at about 18 degrees Celsius, and they typically lay these sticky eggs deep into their clean gravel to give them the best chance of hiding, stuff like that. So as I mentioned, they're named the common minnow. These guys are considered least concern, quite a common fish. They have minor commercial importance, Also, but people like them in aquariums sometimes, and they are often used for baits for other bigger fish. So a really, really awesome little guy here. Cool to talk about these guys. Done by Leaf, Buffzoo, and Fishing Planet, who the Dream Team's kind of done most of the mods in this showcase, but that's okay. So we're going to move on to our next species. Really, really cool guy here. So we're going to be moving on to the European Weatherfish. So this is a really funky little guy. I do love these guys here. This is the European Weatherfish. If you can get a good view. There you are. So the European Weatherfish, or just the Weatherfish, they've got the fossil, the name Magurus fossilis. So they kind of look like a really prehistoric fish, which is really cool. These guys like freshwater. They're a type of loach, before I get into that. So they like freshwater, brackish waters, and they like temperatures between 4 and 25 degrees. And these guys are very, very widespread. They're also Eurasian, so they can be found north of the Alps and eastward into the northern Black Sea and also the Caspian. But they're not native to Great Britain, Scandinavia, and the Iberian Peninsulas, but they can be found in those areas. And they've been locally introduced to some areas, but they're typically found in like central to like eastern Europe and even like Western Asia. So a wide range of fish and a really cool little guy. So as you can see here, these guys have quite long barbules that they use to like feel around for prey and things like that. Very similar to like catfish. And they get a maximum length of about 30 centimeters long, so about a foot long. But a common length will be about 15 centimeters or so, even 11 centimeters. And yeah, really cool fish. You can see they've also got this narrow stripe going down their midline here, like this white stripe. And they usually have a caudal fin that has about 4 to 16 rays on them. And these guys are also facultative air breathers, so they need to breathe air. So they are found in like lower reaches of slow-flowing rivers, but can be found in still ponds because they can breathe air. They can be also found on sandy bottoms of ponds, pools, and ditches. And they're nocturnal, and the males will burrow, and the adults will burrow in the mud during dry periods or strong frosts. So they're able to kind of like hibernate and hide in there and burrow in there. Usually these burrows can be about 20 to 30 centimeters deep. Occasionally during drier periods they can be up to 70 centimeters deep, so very, very deep, especially for a fish of this size. But during the day they will stay buried in the sand and things like that, and when they come out at night they typically feed on insect larvae and small mollusks. And they're seldom captured by hook and line and things like that. They're not very commonly caught as a commercial fish. They're mostly used as baits. And they are sensitive to pollutants, and they often will accumulate in the sediments that they like to dig in and hang around in and feed in. So often a lot of the pollutants from the sediments will go into their bodies, which is very not good. And yeah, the facultative air breathers, as I mentioned, and there was actually a specimen that measured over 30 centimeters long from the Netherlands, so there are some particularly big individuals out there, and I think they're rather cool. And they're another species of least concern, and they're considered harmless, and just a really cool fish that we like talking about. I do like the barbules shape on their faces there. Very funky little loach. Who doesn't love loaches? Loaches are very, very cute. So we're going to move on to the next animal. That was done by Leaf, Buffzoo, and ported from Fishing Planet. Next one, also done by Leaf, Buffzoo, and ported from Fishing Planet. We've got the South American Silver Croaker. I believe that's in here. Yep, there we are. So these guys are another rayfin fish. These guys are a type of drum or croaker. So these guys are freshwater or bethnopelagic, so they're like deep open waters. And they're typically found in tropical waters between 22 to 27 degrees Celsius. And these guys have quite a wide range across, as I mentioned, South America. So these guys can be found in the Amazon, the Paraguay, the Orinoco, and the San Francisco River basins and rivers of Guyana, which is pretty cool. They're also quite big. These guys are about 80 centimeters long in their total body length or so, and their maximum published weight is about 4.5 kilograms. So quite a big fish. These guys, as you can see, they get their name as silver croaker because they're typically quite silverish, but you can see they do have some dark spots around their like fins and things like that. And you can see their lateral line here, which is important for the balance of the fish, is quite prominent. So you can see this line of scales as the lateral line. They also are slightly toothed as well, so they have some slight tooth on them, which is pretty cool. And also really, really cool about these guys is that they occur in very diverse biotypes and can carry out its biological systems both in fresh and brackish waters. That's a very interesting thing about their ecology. And juveniles will typically feed on larvae of crustaceans. They'll also eat copepods and small insects. but small aquatic insects. But adults, as they get bigger, they typically feed on other fish. So these guys are kind of mid-level predators, and they often can be captured during the rainy season. So these guys are also considered least concern, and they're considered harmless, and they're often commercially caught for aquaculture. They're often bred for aquaculture for people to eat. Also, they can be kept in aquariums and things like that. Really, really awesome fish. I do like these guys. A relative of another species coming up, and we'll talk about that, but we're going to be moving on to another cool little guy here. So this is another famous little fish, also done by Leaf Buff Sue, imported from Fishy Planet. We've got the Gudgeon, so a really cool little fish here. So a gudgeon, these guys are a type of little carp gudgeon. So let's see if we can find one swimming around. There we are. So the gudgeon, these guys are cute little guys. These guys are also freshwater, and they like brackish and pelagic, so deep open water. These guys will also like temperatures between 2 and 18 degrees Celsius. And these guys are also quite common. They're another species of like Eurasian or European fish. These guys can be found in the Atlantic Ocean, so North and Baltic Sea basins. They can also be found in the Eastern Great Britain. They can be found in Danube and Finland. But they have been introduced into Northern Italy, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, though that might be kind of out their range. And they actually occur as far east as Korea. And populations from the Iberian Basin and southern France are kind of a different species now, but they've been split into different species, such as the Caspian one or like the southern France ones, or the Iberian Peninsula. But these guys still have generally quite a wide range. So in terms of their size, these guys are another kind of bigger fish. These guys get about 20 centimeters long, or 21 centimeters, but a common length of about 12 centimeters. And they have a maximum published weight of 220 grams, so about like a fifth of a kilo, so not too big. And they have a maximum reported age of about 8 years or so. So you can see these guys have quite long barbules as well, so really helps for sensing things as well. They have quite long eyes and things like that. I like the patterns that it's got here, like those scales. You can see the lateral line there, kind of like these darkish colors to them. And you can kind of tell them apart, small differences between their other relatives and things like that. And in terms of the biology, these guys are pretty common in most like riverine or lake habitats with sandy bottoms. They can be found in small mountain streams, large lakes, and large lowland rivers. They also will inhabit fast-flowing rivers with sand or gravel bottoms, but they may occur in still waters. And these guys are quite a gregarious fish, so they will form schools. They feed on invertebrate larvae, mollusks, and crustaceans, and they're normally active during the day, but if they're disturbed, in particular by predators, they can actually defer their attention to periods where there's light intensity is weak. So they typically active during the day, but when there's a lot of predators or a lot of disturbance, they will hide out and try and come out at different times. So a lot of species will do that. They're also capable of emitting squeaking sounds, and these vocalizations are a way that these fish will communicate with each other. It also varies a lot between the degree of activity and the temperature, and it's actually independent from the season of reproduction, so they just make these sounds for a reason we do not really know. In terms of breeding, these guys will breed over shallow water. Let's see if we can find one. Oh, they're heading up for food. But these guys typically will breed in shallow waters over stones, sand, or plant materials, and eggs are released over a substrate and driven by the current, and then they sink to the bottom and stick to the substrate. And these larvae and juveniles will occur at the bottom and prefer like detritus-rich sandy habitats with low currents, so they can get blown out to sea, or current doesn't take them out to sea. They often will spawn once a year for several years and low productivity streams, but they will, in high productive environments, spawn multiple times a year or multiple times a season. And they typically release eggs above substrate, which drift in the current, and sinks to the bottom, which sticks to the substrate, as I mentioned. And these juvenile will typically hand at the bottom and like the low currents, things like that. So yeah, really, really cool fish. They're also considered least concern. They're not a very highly prized commercial fish, so people do catch them and people use them as baits. So really, really awesome little fish here. I'm a big, big fan. So we've got the gudgeon. So we're moving on now. Next animal we've got is the common snook. So another cool fish. So again, done by Leaf Bovsu and a port from Fishing Planet, because a lot of these are ports from Fishing Planet. This is the common snook. So these guys are a species of marine fish, so we're starting to go out in the ocean now, because why not? These guys are also known as the surgent fish or the robaldo. These guys are actually quite a large species of snook. These guys can grow up to about 140 centimeters as a maximum length, or about 4'6", but they reach a common length of about 50 centimeters, or about 1'6", pretty much. But the world record one being about 50 pounds or 24 kilograms, but they typically do not get this large. And you can see they're quite distinctive because of this quite dark lateral line that you see here, but they have generally quite a silverish color and bright yellow pectoral fins, as you can kind of see there, quite bright colors there. So in terms of their habitat ecology, these guys are an estuarine or freshwater dependent fish. So within estuaries, the juveniles will kind of hang out in areas like coastal ponds, creeks, things like that. And they do not actually they actually are able to thrive in both high and low salinity conditions due to the ability to osmoregulate, so they can regulate the amount of salt in their bodies, which is really interesting. They're also, in terms of their habitat, quite opportunistic predators, so they will pretty much feed on whatever they can find. As they get bigger, they will feed on larger prey, and they've also been found partaking in cannibalism. And this usually occurs when adults and juveniles are kind of proximity, so the adults will eat the babies, which is pretty interesting. And these guys, in terms of their distribution and habitat, these guys can be found widespread through the tropical waters of the western Atlantic Ocean. So they can be found from North Carolina down through the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico and down to Brazil. They originally likely came from Central America, and when the changes of the Earth's climate actually brought them to Florida. And it believed that this may, during the Ice Age, when the world kind of warmed up after the Ice Age, these guys probably moved out to America and things like that. So that's very, very interesting. But these guys often occur in coastal waters that are quite shallow, less than 20 meters deep, and they live in estuarines and lagoons, and even fishery can be found in freshwater. And they have a diet that's really dominant in smaller fishes, but they'll also eat crabs and crustaceans and shrimps as well, so quite generous in that regard. And due to their limited cold tolerance, they can live in Florida, though that's kind of their more northern extent, and there have been populations around North Carolina and Florida, places like that. But in terms of their breeding, these guys are a quadratic hermaphrodite, so which is pretty interesting. So these guys will spawn and appear to be in the span of April to October, with the peak spawning happening between July and August. They typically will spawn in near shore waters with high salinities, and then following this period, the juveniles will migrate into brackish waters and nearby estuarine systems. And when the juveniles mature, they return to high salinity waters and the open ocean to join the breeding populations, which is pretty interesting. So these guys are also a least concerned species. These guys are also quite a common food fish and bait fish. Well, not bait fish, but they're quite common in terms of people to eat, and they're quite common game fish, so people like catching them. So there has been lots of protections, at least in the US, on really strict quotas and stuff like that to help protect populations and keep them sustainable for, obviously, the generations. But they're still quite a common fish, and they seem to be doing quite well. Big fan of these guys. How can you not love a common snook? Pretty awesome. So that one again was done by Leaf, Buff Sue, and Fishing Planet. And we're moving on to another relative of the croaker. We've got here the freshwater drum. So hopefully you are not going to swim into the land. But these guys, the freshwater drum, these guys were fish that are endemic to Northern and Central America. And they're the only member of their genus. So their name, actually in Greek, there's the Anidontas gurinens, I believe you say that. That actually means like the silverback or singleback grunting. That's where they get their name. And it's actually this noise comes from a special set of muscles that are in the body cavity, which allows them to vibrate its swimming bladder to make these sounds. And people don't know why they grunt, but it's done due to be present only in mature males, so they think it might be something to do with spawning, which is very interesting. These guys typically get between 5 and 15 pounds, or about 2 to 6 kilograms, with the world record one getting about 24 kilograms, so that's like a big one. And other names for these guys are croakers, sunfish, sheepheads, things like that. So they're the only North American member of their family to live exclusively in freshwater, and their distribution can be found as far north as the Hudson Bay and as far south as Guatemala. And they can be found around the eastern Appalachian Mountains and also Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And they're actually one of the most widespread species of fish, or in general, in North America. So in terms of the ecology, they typically prefer clear water, but are tolerant of turbid and murky waters. and they prefer being at the bottom to be clear of like gravel and things like that. So they're like clean sand or gravel. So that's where they typically like to prefer. Let's see if we can get. There we are. One swimming around. Okay, so these guys are generally benthic feeders. They feed near the bottom, and they consume like bivalves and mussels and aquatic fish larvae, as well as a small amount of fish. And they actually show distinct differences. They'll feed on different things during different seasons. And they actually compete with several organisms, such as the yellow perch, the trout perch, and the emerald shiner. But due to its during its life lifespan, it typically competes with these guys and competes with black bass in short areas, so there's a lot of competition there. Predators of drum will include humans and other fish. They're kind of seen as a forage fish during their first year of life, so they will be eaten by walleye, smallmouth bass, things like that. And humans do like them since they are quite commercially hunted and things like that, or fished. So they're kind of considered higher value. So there's though the market trends are quite low, but people do like catching them as well. So there are lots of people that want to have a bit of freshwater drum. So yeah, and there's actually been some research considering the impact on invasive zebra mussels by these drums, because the freshwater drum do eat these mussels, and the larger fish are not restricted in their ability to crush these guys, but they can only eat a certain amount. So these guys may actually be quite important in controlling populations, helping control populations of the invasive zebra mussel, though they do not seem to have that big enough impact because they're still quite spreading quite far, which is sad. And during their life history, these guys during the summer, they tend to move into warm, shallow waters at less than 10 meters deep. The freshwater drum then spawn in about a 6 to 7 week period of June through July, when the temperatures reach about 18 degrees Celsius or about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And during this spawning period, the females release their eggs into the water column, and then the males release their sperm. As fertilization is random, and the males generally take 4 years to reach sexual maturity, while females take 5 to 6 years to reach sexual maturity. And a female that is about 6 to 9 years old can actually have a clutch size between 34,000 and 66,500 eggs, and they just lay as many eggs as they can and leave them to go off and do their thing, and they don't really have any parental care. So the eggs will float to the top of the water column and hatch at about 2 to 4 days old, and they can be found in all sorts of different habitats, and many of these larvae and eggs will fall victim to smaller predators, things like that. And yeah, females typically grow at a faster rate than males, and they can reach those larger sizes quite a bit quicker. So females will grow throughout their lives, and males will continue to grow through their lives, reaching a length of about 30 to 76 centimeters long. So just keep growing. And in terms of the current management, there's not too much management on these guys, but there are daily bag limits and things like that. Well, that are unlimited, and they are not really federally or state listed in any states. And they commonly harvest about 1 million pounds of these guys per year, but there's no danger of over harvest. So they obviously harvested, but not too much to a point where people think they're endangered. And the Mississippi River alone is believed to be about 300,000 pounds or about 140,000 kilograms of freshwater drum taken out in recent years. And due to this abundance, many states allow bow fishing and stuff like that, and non-commercial means to harvest this fish, so they're doing okay in that regard. So really, really awesome. How can you not love these fishies? So next we're moving on to another marine fish. So we've got here the bi-leaf buffsue neretistic, I believe you say that. We have got the French angelfish. So these are cool guys here. So these guys are a type of angelfish, type of sturgeon fish. And these guys are marine reef fish, so you typically find them in coral reefs, things like that. They're also non-migratory and live at depths between 3 to 100 meters, and they're considered subtropical. And their range kind of goes quite wide. They can be found in the Western Atlantic, they can be found in Florida, USA, the Bahamas, to Brazil, and can be found in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And they're quite a big fish. These guys get about 40 centimeters long, and male on 6, but they were common length is about 28 centimeters. And these guys, you can see they're quite black, and they've got these really beautiful colors to them. They've got yellowish tips to their fins as well, the dorsal and anal fins. They've got some other little things there, and their face is quite bright with those yellow eyes. Really gives them a really distinct look. So in terms of their biology, they're quite common in shallow reefs, They're usually found in pairs near sea fans, and these guys typically feed on sponges, algae, bryozoans, zonozoans, and tourniquets and things like that. And they're viparous, so that means they lay eggs. They're also monogamous, so they all pair up and pretty much stay together for a while. A spawning pair can be quite territorial, and usually they will vigorously defend these areas of their territory from other neighboring pairs. And juveniles tend to cleansing stations where they serve a variety of clients. So, juvenile sturgeon fish, or angelfish, as these ones are better called, so French angelfish. These juveniles will come to these cleaning stations and will help animals such as other sturgeonfish, wrasses, morays, snappers, things like that, and clean them off. And at the station, the cleaner displays like a fluttering, swimming, and then the cleaner touches the client with its pelvic fins. And the flesh is actually considered good quality and marketed, and often is reared in captivity because these guys can be eaten, and they're also quite common for the aquarium trade. So, in terms of their life cycle, these guys will actually have permanent pairing and monogamous pairs, so these guys will kind of pair up for life. And during most of the observation period, the single pair will swim slowly side by side at a height of about 25 to 75 centimeters above the reef, so they tend to like to hang on that regard. And it's not really often swollen with eggs in that regard, but slowly after sunset, these guys will kind of ascend in a broad, shallow arc and kind of spawn. And if they're not actually touching, these guys will kind of spawn together. And other pairs in the area will be seen making similar arching movements, things like that, around the same time. And it's difficult to see if there were gametes released in this event, but it's most likely that they were. And there's no interference between pairs when they are spawning. And monogamous pairs have been observed to be both obligate and social, so these guys are quite monogamous. They like to hang around each other for life. Really, really cool fish. And they also consider least concern, though issues such as ocean acidification, destroying coral reefs could be a big issue for these guys. But there is minor commercial interest in these guys. So people do eat them, but not really often. But mainly it's the aquarium trade, and they have been reared in captivity, so that helps bring a lot of pressure off the wild population. So they're doing okay. Really, really awesome fish. I know the mirror carp thing is wrong, but it's just wasn't properly coded, I don't think. So next we've got another one from Leaf Buffsu and Fishing Planet. We've got, moving into bigger animals now, we've got the Sterlet. So let's have a look at these cool little guys. Cute little sturgeon fish. Let's see, there was one there. So a sterlet, these guys are a relatively small species of sturgeon that are from Eurasia, and they're native to large rivers that flow into like the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and can be found in rivers in Siberia and Far East as Yosemite, maybe you say that. There were populations migrating between salt and freshwater, but these populations have been extirpated, so most populations now only live in freshwater. And these guys typically get about 16 kilograms in weight and get about 100 to 125 centimeters long, which is actually quite small for a sturgeon. And even then, they really exceed a length of 90 centimeters, so are quite a small sturgeon. And they're quite variable in color, but you can see this is more typical. And they're distinguished from other species by the presence of a great number of these whitish lateral scutes and these fringed barbules, and also quite an elongated narrow snout, which is quite interesting for a sturgeon. And these guys, in terms of their diet, these guys feed mainly on benthic organisms, so like really small like worms and crustaceans and insect larvae in that regard. And in terms of life history, these guys are longer lived. They can reach an age of about 22 to 25 years of age, with males reaching sexual maturity at about 3 to 7 years old and females between 4 and 12. The spawning will typically occur from the middle of April and beginning of June, and females may lay egg from between 15,000 to 44,000 eggs, and water temperature typically they like to lay in is between 12 and 17 degrees. So in terms of their conservation and stuff, which is really, really sad, these guys, due to overfishing, due to like caviar and its flesh, population pollutions have been a big issue, and dams, they've been listed as endangered, sadly. And there luckily are restocking projects, and they've been introduced to some regions outside their natural range, but they have generally not been self-sustaining, so these guys are typically kind of helped a lot by aquaculture, so try to take not as much from the wild populations, which is good. But these guys, as I mentioned, they can be found on the debut, things like that. As a food fish, these guys are actually pretty good tasting. And in terms of pond fish, these guys need large ponds with good water conditions, and they can get entangled plants such as blanket weed. They also require special foods as well. And They're actually quite common in the Danube. These are kind of the last of the 5... sorry, coughing. One of the last of the 5 native sturgeon species inhabiting the Danube, and their populations have dropped significantly, mainly due to degradation of habitats in there and spawning and foraging grounds. But luckily there are some people trying to help them out. Really cool little species. Sterlets are definitely awesome. So let me just quickly grab a drink. I'm just going to make sure. There, my throat's okay. So next we're moving on, last but most certainly not least. We've got a cool animal here. We've got the frilled shark, done by Leaf, Buff Zoo, and Deep Silver. So this is a really cool fish that we're going to have a look at. Really, really awesome. So the frilled shark and its close related species, the South African frilled shark. These guys are living representatives of the family Chasmosauridae. And these guys are often considered a living fossil because they have a very primitive looking body. You can see they've got quite an eel-like body and look quite like what prehistoric sharks or early sharks would have looked like. And these two species are typically distributed through the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The Southern African frilled shark is obviously found in Southern Africa, but these guys can be found in New Zealand, Australia, off the coast of the US in some places, like California, off Europe. Basically, really deep sea animals. And as I mentioned, lots of early paleontologists and things like that, and early scientists thought these guys were extinct relatives of lots of prehistoric sharks, such as like the Clacidicidae genus, which was a shark from the Devonian. Also some other sharks like hybodonts from like the late Jurassic and the Jurassic period. But these guys are actually more closely related to like cow sharks. In terms of genetic analysis, they actually may be related to like the hexagonophomes. So though they might not be related to those really prehistoric sharks, these guys in reality are still like a really interesting species. And they're considered a living fossil because of this really like unchanged anatomy. So they look very similar to those prehistoric like Devonian and Jurassic sharks, though they're not that closely related to them. Though this group would have first appeared in the late Cretaceous or the late Jurassic, so between 150 to 95 million years ago. Though the species itself is actually quite young, and it comes from the early Pleistocene, so about 2 million years ago. Early Pleistocene epoch, so about 2 to 11 million years ago, so from like the Miocene to the late early Pleistocene. So this is quite a younger species in that regard. And in terms of their habitat and distribution, these guys are quite deep species. So these guys can be found in like continental shelves and like slopes and things like that. And they feed on a diet of smaller sharks, cephalopods, bony fish, things like that. And they actually might dial vertical migration. So they kind of will swim up to the surface of the ocean to feed at night, which is very interesting. And they can be found at depths more commonly between 50 and 200 meters deep. But they like the cooler, deeper waters. And in the Eastern Atlantic Ocean, they can be found off Norway, Scotland, Ireland, West Africa, places like that. And in the West Pacific, they can be found in Western Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, Chile, places like that. So they're quite sparsely populated. And as I mentioned, the other species, South African frilled shark, it's very likely due to this patchy distribution, there could be more species of shark, or we just don't really, of the frilled shark, or we just don't really know exactly how their distributions were. So you can see they've got this quite eel-long body, and they get the name the frilled shark because they almost look like they have a frill from their kind of gills there. And they've got very interesting shaped teeth, as doesn't really show you there, but if you look at a picture of these guys have like these frilled needle-like teeth that are really great for eating soft-bodied animals such as cephalopods, small sharks, and bony fish. And these guys can actually also get quite large. You can see they've got like a grayish skin, and they can get to about 5'6" or about 1.7 meters long. And a larger female could get about 2 meters long, but they typically get to about a meter and a half long. So they're not like ridiculously huge sharks, but they look really, really interesting. They also have no nictating membrane, which is a protective third membrane that protects their eyelids. So these guys probably don't have the best sight. They look quite similar to, they actually are able to open their jaws and actually eat food that is quite a bit bigger than themselves. Quite similar to things like gulper eels and viperfish, which is a quite common addition to the deep ocean. And the gill filaments here, they almost look like they have a frill, so they've got like frilly, kind of fleshy like the extended tips as well, so that's where they get the name the frilled shark. You can see they've got that quite eel-like body, so they've got small fins and all that, so they don't really have a big pectoral fin. Really looks like a really ancient type of shark, which is pretty awesome. So, yeah, in terms of their biology, these guys have a cartilaginous skeleton like other species of sharks, so they don't have bones. And they have a large liver filled with like low-density lipids that help them maintain their buoyancy in the water. They also have mechanoreceptor hair cells, which can grooves that are exposed to the open environment that allows them to detect changes in movements in the surrounding water, which is also very interesting. And a little bit about their ecology as we see them come on land. Actually, in New Zealand, there's actually fossils of these guys from the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary that suggests that their relatives, or their early relatives, may have actually lived in shallow bodies of water far from the ocean, because they've been found with birds and conifer cone fossils. And they actually, this may be a later development, so they may have been more shallow water species, or their early ancestors would have been living more in shallow waters, and then eventually they kind of moved out into the deep sea and evolved into that. So even though they do look like living fossils, they may actually be like evolved to survive in the deep ocean. So their anatomy isn't a true living fossil, they just adapted to the deep sea environment. So that's why living fossil as a term is not a very good term to say, because often living fossils can be quite young and often are adapted for certain habitats. But anyway, these are still quite cool. As I mentioned, their diet, they feed on sea slugs, smaller sharks. 60% of their diet or so is squids, and they've even been seen eating big things like Japanese cat sharks that can be up to like a 590 gram cat shark. So they also mainly eat squids and things like that. If hunting and eating prey, they typically feed on prey that's like exhausted or tired. They will often curve its body around and try to strike its prey, so almost like a snake, which is really interesting. They also have quite strong jaws as well, which is also really cool. The behavior of captive specimens that actually suggests that these guys will actually hunt with their mouth opens and use dark and light contrast of their white teeth and lure prey to its maw. And then also will suck in prey, so they use negative pressure, so they'll often suck in prey that comes into their mouth and things like that. And these guys actually have relatively little to no food in their stomachs, and they either have a fast digestion rate or they can go a long time between feeding, which is a common thing for deep sea animals. They often will go a long time without food, and that's why it allows them to be so long-lived, which is pretty awesome. So in terms of reproduction, they reach sexual maturity at about a meter or a meter to 1.2 meters long for males, so about 3 to 3.9 feet, and then females will get about 1.3 to 3.5 or 4 to nearly 5 feet long. They become sexually reproductive. So these guys have 2 ovaries and a uterus, which is on the right side of her body, and these guys will form like yolks and stuff typical of other sharks. These guys are also ovoviparous, so these guys will have egg that is kept in the mother's uterus, and during gestation the eggs will develop like a membranous egg cases and stuff like that, and when the infant shark emerges from these capsules in the uterus, they'll feed on the yolk until they're born. And the young shark embryos have slightly developed jaws and a prominent head, and they may actually use this a lot to kind of just filter things like that. And through embryonic development, the yolk sac remains constant as well. And they actually, once they get out, they kind of grow at a pretty steady rate of about 1.4 centimeters per month until birth. That's how they grow in the womb. And then the shark pups are born at about 40 to 60 centimeters long, or about 16 to 24 inches. And actually, their gestation period is quite a long time as well, and it can be as long as about 3.5 years. And when they're born, their litter can be between like 2 to 15 pups, though an average litter is about 6 pups. And another cool thing about these guys are often caught as bycatch in like gill nets or longline nets, so people don't really like eating them. But though people can eat them, they're considered Noosa's fish. They're kind of valued for fish meat as like a meat. And there have been some people seeing them in quite deep waters as well, and caught in trawler, things like that. And in 2016, there were actually concerns of like commercial overfishing in these feeding areas of these deep sea sharks. So that's why the IUCN called the frilled shark a species that was considered under their threat, and then reclassed it from a species of least concern after that. So they are technically considered least concern, but really just don't know much about these deep water habitats and how well they're actually doing. So they could be actually quite endangered, and As I mentioned, these guys are quite slow breeders, and like lots of most large predators, these guys could be quite susceptible to extinction, so hopefully there's more research in that regard. Though, they are kind of considered by the New Zealand's red identification system as, like, at risk or naturally common, since they're not easy to find in the wild because they live so deep in the ocean, but hopefully they're doing well, and, there's lots of conservation efforts to protect them because they're really such an interesting species. They're quote-unquote a living fossil, but I just still think they're quite a cool animal. So that guy was done by Leaf Buffzoo and Deep Silver Wildlife Planet 2. So that came out rather well. And yeah, so thank you all for making these wonderful fish mods. I do enjoy talking about these wonderful fish. So yeah, I think this would be a very great place to end the video. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified about anything. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.